So first, I'm gonna just describe the plumbing of the system for calibration purposes. When you're calibrating the CO2 and O2 sensor on S159, the gas switching system does not need to be connected. What we do need is a gas pump if the pump is not part of the S159, because sometimes you can have the pump built in. You need a gas pump, which is going to bring gas. In this case, it's just room air, and it's going to carry this gas through this blue filter into the flow monitor. That's where the flow is measured first. Comes out of the flow monitor, and it's delivered to the soda lime column, where the gas is scrubbed of CO2. In this case, we are getting the zero CO2 gas being delivered. Then it's delivered through a drying column to make sure that the gas is dry. From the drying column, it goes into the CO2 analyzer, and then out of the CO2 analyzer, it's carried to the oxygen sensor, and then it vents out. The sensors on the S159 analyzer, both CO2 and O2, have a linear response, so all we need is 2 points to calibrate each sensor. We're going to start with the CO2, and we're delivering 0 CO2 right now to that sensor because we're scrubbing just room air through a soda lime column. You can monitor in the software the reading, and you can see here the CO2 is dropping down to 87 parts per million. When this stabilizes, we will wait for a few minutes. When it stabilizes, we will adjust the CO2 zero on the analyzer itself. Usually it takes 2 to 5 minutes for that to stabilize. We've already been running gas for a few minutes, so we're more or less there. And you can see that this is not reading 0, but it's reading 7 point something. So we have to go up here and adjust this CO2 zero while looking at software. To adjust the CO2 zero, you have to first release the knob by pushing it up, and then turning it anti-clockwise will reduce the reading, and clockwise will increase it. So I'm going down to 0 here by turning this knob. We're at 2, 1, and 0. When this has been adjusted, make sure that you turn this little locking tab back down so you can't accidentally change this knob by touching it. So that's our first point set. Now for our second point, we will remove the soda lime, so the CO2 is not being scrubbed anymore. Remove the soda lime and just connect the drying column directly to the flow monitor. And now we need to connect a gas bag with a known CO2 standard gas to the pump. So here we have a gas bag with a 505 parts per million levels of CO2. We're connecting that to the pump input, and that's what's being delivered from the pump to the flow monitor and the rest of the system. It is important to know the exact level of CO2. You then come to your readout of CO2, the meter in the software, and you wait for that to stabilize. If this reading is different than 505 ppms, then we will adjust it on the analyzer. And during this calibration process, notice that we're not collecting any data. I'm just simply looking at these meters. However, if one wanted to, you could start collecting data just to have a record of how you've adjusted things. So you can see the CO2 is stabilizing around 511 parts per million. What we need to do is we need to reduce that to 505, and we do that with the CO2 span. Again, we have to unlock this knob by pushing the tab up, and then you reduce the reading by turning it anti-clockwise, and if you have to increase it, you turn it clockwise. So 503, 502, I've gone too far. 505, and then you'd lock it in. If you had to do a big adjustment of CO2 span, it's a good idea to go back to 0. So disconnect the bag, connect your solder line, and check 0 again. If 0 is very much different, the reading for 0 is very much different by about 40-50 parts per million, you may need to use course 0. Course 0 adjusts CO2 0 you have to be very cautious, because very small changes in course 0 can result in big changes in the software. So you unlock the tab the same way as we did before. You adjust it very slowly, you wait, you adjust a little bit, you wait for a few minutes to make sure, because there's a little bit of a delay in what the reading in the software shows versus the reading in versus changes of the knob, so you have to be careful. But we're good to go with CO2. We've set the CO2, and now we're going to move to calibrating oxygen. For calibration of the oxygen sensor, again, we're using 2 points. It's a linear calibration. The first point has to be 0 oxygen, and that can come from a gas bag which has nitrogen gas in it, or in this case, I actually have the CO2 standard, which I used for calibrating of the CO2 sensor, is in the background of pure nitrogen. So I can, with the same gas, 505 parts per million CO2 and 0% oxygen, I can calibrate both sensors. So we're putting a gas with 0 oxygen through the analyzer, and if you come up here, you can see that the reading under oxygen is 0.562%, so it's close to 0 but not quite. We then need to go to oxygen 0 knob. The same way, we release the tab by pushing it upwards, and then slowly turn the oxygen 0 knob anti-clockwise to reduce the reading in the software down to 0. You will notice that in the software, the reading says O2P core. That stands for pressure corrected, because we have a pressure sensor next to the oxygen sensor, and with changes in atmospheric pressure, there could be changes to oxygen level as well. So we do this correction in the software, and therefore you see displayed here corrected for pressure oxygen reading. And we're close to 0 now. Just went over. But there we are. Again, we lock this in place. Okay, and now for the second point of the oxygen sensor, we will disconnect this bag with the standard CO2 and pure nitrogen, and we're just now bringing in room air through the pump to the analyzer. But remember, this room air is going through a drying column, and dry air, outside air, dry, contains 20.95% oxygen. So we can use to calibrate the oxygen sensor, one can use just outside air that has been dried. So we're gonna wait for that gas to go through the sensor and the analyzer. So we now have dry air running through the oxygen sensor. You can see the reading is stabilized around 20.15. And as I mentioned, dry air is going to have 20.95%. So to adjust the oxygen reading here and to adjust our oxygen span, we go to our O2 span. We release the tab again by pushing it up. And this time we need to increase the reading to 20.95. So we're turning it clockwise, 20.3. And you do this slowly so you don't overshoot, otherwise you have to come back down again. About 20.95 is what we're aiming for, because that's the level of oxygen in dry outside air. So one only needs to have really one gas tank to calibrate both CO2 and O2 sensors. Here we go, 20.96 I've just gone over. So I'm going back down again, 20.9695. So lock the tab back in once the O2 span has been on. So one only needs to have one gas tank for calibrating of the S159 analyzer. If you obtain a CO2 standard gas in the background of nitrogen, then you can use that same tank to calibrate the oxygen sensor and the CO2 sensor. And the second point for each, in terms of CO2, you have the soda lime, which is scrubbing CO2 to get 0. And for oxygen sensor, you have outside air, which is providing 20.95% oxygen when it's dried through a soda lime column. So now both sensors are set up and calibrated, and basically the analyzer is ready to be used, and we will cover now how to set up the system with the gas switcher.